Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I am the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, a pioneer of the modern art market, we are joined by Simon Kelly, curator and head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art. This talk is in conjunction with the recent publication of Simon's book, Théodore Rousseau and the Rise of the Modern Art Market, an avant-garde landscape painter in 19th century France. Thanks so much for being here today, Simon.
Thanks, Jessica. And thank you everyone else who is here. So actually, I haven't seen the book physically myself yet. It did come out in early May, but the mail hasn't actually brought it to me in St. Louis yet. So I'll be excited to actually see it in person. But it is a book that I've worked on for what seems a very long time. So it's great to finally see it come to fruition. So what I'm going to do today is just give a sort of relatively brief introduction to some of the themes of the talk, of the book rather. As Jessica mentioned, the title of the book links Rousseau to the history of the art market. Really in the 19th century, I argue in the book, I'm not the first to do this, but there is a kind of transformation within the art market in France, an expansion of the art dealer sector, a growth of the auction house, an internationalization of exhibition networks, the rise of new kinds of exhibition strategy, for example, the retrospective, the rise of new modes of reproduction, which impact the market, for example, photography. And the book kind of situates Rousseau within the context of these broader developments and argues for his agency as a kind of newly professional artist in the mid 19th century. I don't think Rousseau is unique in this. I mean, there are other artists, Delacroix, for example, d'Aubigny is another who also engage with broad market sectors. There are a wide number you could cite, but Rousseau is, I would suggest, particularly adept in his marketing methods and knowledgeable of the art market. So here is a photograph, a carte de visite of Rousseau on the left here. He was born in Paris. He grew up in the capital, and I think that that actually helped his kind of facility, his knowledge of the art market. His studios were always just around the Montmartre area, close to the Rue Lafitte, which was the center of the art market in Paris, also close to the Hotel Drouot, which was the principal auction house in Paris. Here you can see him looking actually very much like a businessman on the left, with his embroidered waistcoat and his pocket watch. I also wanted to include this drawing on the right, because this is a drawing by Jean-Francois Millet, who was Rousseau's closest artist friend, and who you'll know from the Millet Modern Art Show. And this shows Rousseau in a kind of another light. Rousseau, in his kind of self-fashioning, saw himself very much as an outsider. That created tensions with the market, but it was also something that he used as an active marketing tool to kind of encourage notoriety and market interest around his work. In terms of his subjects, I mean, Rousseau is pretty much exclusively a landscape painter. There are one or two portraits, but he is, his focus is landscape, and he focused on the landscape of France. And here you can see a sort of range of the regions of France that he represented. Normandy, Berry, Franche-Comté, Jura, Auvergne, the Landes in the southwest. Probably the principal region of France that he didn't paint is actually Provence, at the bottom left of the image here. He was going to go to Provence in 1860, but it never actually happened. So you could argue there's a kind of nationalism to his project, although in his marketing, he's actually very, very transnational. Another thing that it's worth noting is that Rousseau is painting France at a time when the rail network is developing around the country. And Rousseau quite self-consciously chooses not to paint the railway, but his market is definitely impacted by the rise of the railroad and the kind of idea that his audience, his market, which is an urban audience, was responding to their ability to visit precisely the regions that Rousseau was representing as a result of travel improvements with the railroad. So in terms of Rousseau's marketing, how I'm going to structure the rest of this talk is to look at the different spaces that he was showing his work in. The most important space in early to mid 19th century France for showing paintings in France was the Paris Salon. And Rousseau showed work there in the early part of his career, but the two paintings that I'm showing here were actually refused. The one on the left, one of the interesting things about Rousseau is the degree to which he experimented with pigments. And the one on the left is so dark now, it's actually darkened because of Rousseau's use of bitumen and also mummy, as in Egyptian mummies, pigments which were extracted from mummies. And you know, this work on the left actually has 16 layers of paint. And that experiment, in some ways, the lack of legibility in some of Rousseau's works, you really have to look hard to read them, is also part of his modernism, the kind of quasi-abstract quality to his work. But on the left, this is actually a group of cows who are descending a gorge in the Jura. And on the right, again, this is an important painting which is now in the Louvre. So Rousseau's paintings were refused in the early part of his career, and this earned him the epithet of Le Grand Refusé. So he wanted to show at the Salon, but the refusals actually gained in notoriety, and he was supported by a number of significant figures within the Parisian artistic community, one of the most notable of whom is George Sand, the prominent feminist writer, and she really took Rousseau under her wing. She was responsible for finding state patronage for him. She wanted him to actually marry her adopted daughter, Augustine Brault. And there's a extensive correspondence between Sand and Rousseau. You can make comparisons between Sand's pastoral novels and Rousseau's images of the Berry region. And Rousseau himself, actually, we know, went to Sand's chateau at Nohant in the Berry. So back to the Salon. This painting here was shown at the Salon of 1851. It was one of 7 paintings that Rousseau showed, and were actually pretty controversial. Rousseau was associated with republicanism, with left-wing politics from fairly early on, but the critical discourse around his painting at the Salon focused largely on finish. And again, getting back to that point about the sort of quasi-abstract quality of Rousseau's work. Here, if you look at this painting, you have to look carefully, but there are 2 cows who are actually coming down to the pond here. And then this is a charcoal burner's hut. This is actually a figure here. You can see in the detail at the top right. So there's a letter from Rousseau. This is one of two paintings that we know he showed 7, and this is one of 2 that he hadn't sold at the Salon. And he sent a letter to a collector for which he produced 2 or 3 drafts, really trying to sell the painting hard, and producing this drawing of the work, which you can see at bottom right. Ultimately, he didn't succeed in selling it to that collector, but he sold it soon after to another collector. So Rousseau was controversial in the early part of his career for the kind of very gestural aspect of his finish. In the later part of his career, he was equally controversial for a very different kind of finish, or facture. And that was a kind of proto-pointillist finish that he used, and which you can see in this picture, which I was lucky enough actually to I rediscovered this painting in a collection in Portugal, actually in 2001. And here is an important painting for Rousseau, and that is now part of the Clark collection. But it does show that kind of proto-pointillist touch that looks forward to Seurat. And that continues right until the end of Rousseau's career. You can see it in this painting, which is now in the Minneapolis Institute. And when this one was shown at the Salon in 1867, you can see the caricature at the top right. It was compared by this caricaturist Bertel to tapisserie au petit point, or tapestry with tiny stitches. And you can see that in the detail at bottom right, those kind of little dots that Rousseau was using that again kind of look forward to Seurat. Critics really didn't know what to make of this. It's very different to the kind of academic polished finish that was prevalent in a lot of painting at the Salon. But again, this interest in new kinds of finish is part of Rousseau's innovation, and why, you know, I call him avant-garde in the subtitle of the book. So that that kind of avant-garde quality, in some ways, it created problems with his market, but it also led to his finding a group of actually very loyal patrons who did respond to his innovation, and that's something that I do explore in the book. But here I wanted to speak about a second important space that Rousseau was innovative in using, and that's the auction house. So the Salon was a very established space for artists to show work in. It was a kind of shop window, but the idea of organizing auctions of your own work was a more recent development in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and Rousseau was among the first artists to use that strategy. So this, what I'm showing here is actually a poster of Rousseau's first, he organized 3 auction sales of his paintings. It's a strategy which is still being used today. Damien Hirst, for example, organized a sale of his paintings in 2008, and it's a way of kind of sidestepping dealers and making a direct appeal to a public. And here you can see on this poster it says tableau et études, paintings and studies, peint d'après nature. The idea of Rousseau as an open-air painter was something that he often promoted in terms of the marketing of his work. And you can see here that the sale is taking place at the Rue des Jeuneurs. This is actually just before the auction house moved to the Hotel Drouot. That happened in 1852. And I'm going to show you just a range of the works that were in this sale. So on the left, a work which was actually bought by the French state. On the right, a work which shows the Château de Chambord on the Clos de la Loire. And Rousseau was always interested in chiaroscuro, and here you can see that sort of contrast between darkness and the illuminated chateau in the distance. This is a beautiful painting that was exhibited and it was, you know, Rousseau thought of these sales as exhibitions, you can argue that they were kind of retrospectives. I talked about the retrospective at the beginning as an important novel mode of exhibition in the 19th century. These auction sales were retrospectives, even at least the first show, which showed 20 years of Rousseau's works from 1830 to 1850. But even though they were very brief exhibitions before the sale, they were exhibitions. And in the context of this painting, which was shown in Rousseau's second sale in 1861, Rousseau insisted that all the paintings in that show should be previously unexhibited, be new works. He worked hard to promote his prices in other auctions before the sale, and there are various letters in which he made efforts to ensure that influential people came to these auctions. And he was successful, and these auctions enjoyed, particularly the first two, enjoyed some considerable success. This is actually a view, incidentally, out of Rousseau's, or from the back of Rousseau's studio. That's his, on the right, that's the entrance to his backyard. So it's actually a view onto the area behind his house. Rousseau was fascinated by the sublime, used light as a means of generating emotion. You can really get a sense of that in this painting. You can see why, so many of the Hudson River School artists like George Inness, for example, were deeply interested in Rousseau, in addition to many European artists, Van Gogh most notably. So then to move on to dealers. The mid-19th century really sees an expansion of the dealer sector in Paris. In the 1820s, there are around approximately 25 dealers in Paris who are listed in the Paris commercial directory. That number had increased to or quadrupled by the 1850s to more than 100. What I'm showing you here is a print of one of the most important galleries in Paris, and that was the gallery of Jean Rouelle, whose career, or the family's career, has been explored in a recent exhibition in Paris, and also at the Philadelphia Museum and the National Gallery in London. This is a print from 1845, which shows, you can see this is quite a lavish space, and the growing importance of the dealer gallery as a kind of counterpoint to the Paris Salon space. Rousseau is working closely with a number of dealers, particularly from the late 1840s and 1850s, a number of whom do have the galleries on the Rue Lafitte. His correspondence, much of which is unpublished, indicates that he was involved with at least 10 dealers, and he was very strategic in the way in which he worked with these dealers, kind of playing them off one against the other in order to acquire higher prices. We know from one letter, for example, he was particularly happy with a painting for which the agreed price had been 1,000 francs, but then he managed to extract a higher price of 2,000 francs from the dealer for his painting. He was quite controlling. He kept control over his images to the extent that he insisted on varnishing them and also framing them, controlling the kind of frames that he wanted on the pictures. And in the 1850s, he was showing this kind of work, which was more it didn't have the kind of avant-garde quality of his early gestural work or the late proto-pointillist work, but this kind of precisely finished touch, which you see in his paintings, such as this of the 1850s, it did enjoy a considerable market. And shrewdly, he also showed this kind of work at the Salon as a mode of promoting that, this kind of facture within that important space. This kind of production was encouraged by his partner, Elisa Gros, who's, I think, an important figure within his output. And there's a kind of asymmetrical archive because we don't have any correspondence from her. We just have Rousseau's correspondence. she was important, I think, in encouraging his engagement with the market and encouraging him to work with this range of dealers. This is his studio in Barbizon. He maintained 2 studios, at least from the late 1840s, his studio in Paris and his studio in Barbizon. On the left rather is his house, and on the right is a barn which he expanded, added skylights, and here he would entertain visitors in a kind of way that foresees what Monet would do at Giverny in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I think an interesting thing about Rousseau, and this again, this is one of Rousseau's masterpieces. It's in the Metropolitan. This is a dark slide. You have to go and see it, but it's a very beautiful painting. There's a real sense of the spiritual, the sublime to it. There are 2 tiny figures in the foreground of women carrying sticks who are kind of overwhelmed by the immensity of the trees. Rousseau never sold this painting. He worked on it for over 20 years. And his dealer production enabled him to continue his work on paintings which often remained in his studio until his death and are often more experimental in their facture. This one has a whole range of different kinds of brushwork. Rousseau used the palette knife, scraper, his thumb, the back of the butt end of his brush. He talked about these as diabolic methods, and you see this kind of fascination with new kinds of facture again and again in his work. He was also one of the first artists to be interested in Japanese prints, and again that's part of his innovation. And he collected them. We don't know specifically which prints, but here I think in this painting on the left, which again was unsold, it remained in his studio until his death. You can see the kind of flatness. I think it was interested in Japanese prints for their kind of flat, abstract quality, and the kind of way that they promoted an alternative way of viewing to the Western academic tradition. I think he saw himself very much as an anti-academic artist. Internationalization is an important theme within his markets. On the left is an important Belgian dealer, Arthur Stevens, with whom he had a lot of dealings. And this is a painting on the right. I love the handlebar moustache of Stevens here. But this is a painting on the right, which again has that kind of that difficulty of viewing. You have to look very carefully to see the complexity of the elements within this work. That again is part of Rousseau's innovation. And I think, places him within a sort of wider avant-garde and modernist narrative, that kind of quasi-abstract quality to his work. But Stevens, in terms of his markets, Stevens was an important figure in internationalizing his markets, finding a range of international collectors, for example, in Belgium. Rousseau was also sending works to England, showed interest in Germany, particularly in the later part of his career. And then sort of finishing up here, these are 2 dealers who are absolutely kind of pivotal to his career. On the left, I showed you earlier on the gallery of Jerome Royal. This is the gallery that I showed before was actually Paul Jerome Royal's father's gallery. So this is from that earlier image. This is around 20 years later. And this is an image of Paul Jerome Royal, who has been, as I said, who has been explored in the recent exhibition, and has often been seen as a kind of pioneering figure in his collecting Impressionism. But I argue actually in that catalogue that a lot of the strategies that he used for his support of Impressionism actually originate in his support of the Barbizon artists, and particularly Rousseau. And on the right is a figure, another important dealer with whom Jerome Royal collaborated, Hector Brahm, who's less well known, was actually the model for the dealer in Émile Zola's The Masterpiece, a former actor, a fascinating figure. But he and Jerome Royal worked very closely to promote Rousseau's work. And most notably in 1866 and 1867, they acquired 91 works from Rousseau's studio in a single batch. And Rousseau, he was actually reticent about that initially because they were principally sketches, which he considers kind of private works as part of his artistic process, which he didn't want to reveal to a wider public. But he changes his attitude, and he realizes their potential value as commodity, and he sells, as I say, 91 of works from his studio for 100,000 francs in 1867. That's a very considerable amount of money. It's a strategy which looks forward to Manet and Cézanne later on, also selling work from their studio. And those works were celebrated in a retrospective exhibition at a space called the Cercle de l'Union Artistique, also known as the Cercle des Arts. And this is a slightly later image of that space. It was a space which was known for its kind of intimacy, in contrast to the enormous spaces of the Salon, and was seen as being particularly suitable for landscape paintings, which were often quite small in scale. This is a catalogue for the exhibition, which was written by a friend of Rousseau, Philippe Berti. There was a kind of network, the whole idea of sort of dealer-critic networks or dealer-critic system is apt here. And Berti talked about Rousseau's work in the catalogue. He promoted the idea of the fact that these were the first time that these studies had been seen in public, but he also promoted the show as a kind of vicarious journey around France, presenting Rousseau as a kind of national painter of France. So I'm just going to run through a range of the works in the exhibition. Here are a couple of Auvergne from Rousseau's visit in 1830. Here are a couple of Normandy. Rousseau's an interesting painter of marines, which is often overlooked. And this was actually a painting that we managed to acquire at the St. Louis Art Museum in 2016. This is a view at Compiègne. And you can see again here, there are kind of sort of abstract elements. This is actually a pheasant flying up here. You can see here a cow who's coming down to a pond or a pool to water. And it's one of Rousseau's few paintings of moonlight. This is a lovely panoramic view looking over Paris. You can see the Invalides right in the distance here. This is a study, which is more legible than that very dark painting, the darkened painting that I showed right at the beginning of the talk, where you can see more clearly the mountains in the background and the descending cows. Rousseau was kind of really celebrating I think the rural customs of the Jura. And his father actually came from the Jura. An important aspect of Rousseau is a kind of ecological angle. And here on the left, you can see a painting which shows the felling of trees. And he actually hung this in his studio until the end of his career as a kind of warning to visitors against deforestation, against the felling of trees. And that, he experienced that principally actually in the forest of Fontainebleau. And these two also show the importance of the grisaille as a mode of painting for Rousseau, which he was actually prepared to sign and sell as a finished painting. Here are a group of the forest of Fontainebleau, which show particularly the one on the right, which is on panel. Rousseau's ability to capture the moment. Here, the rain which is falling through the clouds within a rain shower. The top left, a beautiful painting acquired by the Getty, and at the bottom left, this is a painting. It's not completely certain, but I think this was in the retrospective at the Cercle from Cleveland. And then these are also two paintings in that show which show Rousseau's more finished, sort of more, as I said, proto-pointillist late style. And Rousseau was happy with the exhibition, and particularly the catalogue. He wrote this letter, which was subsequently published to Philippe Berti, who'd written the catalogue, which essentially said that the catalogue acted as a very kind of sensitive record of his works, which he knew would subsequently be dispersed, and they were. And we know from the stock books of Jerome Roel, which survive. So many of the other dealers, their stock books don't survive from the mid 19th century, but those of Jerome Roel do, and they're an incredibly important resource. And I've included a lot of them actually relating to Rousseau in the book. But you can see the sort of international range of collectors who are buying Rousseau's work, and also the increase in prices. Just to take one example, the St. Louis painting, the Jerome Roel and Brahm managed to sell it at a 4-fold profit only a year after they'd acquired it from Rousseau. So just to finish up, so I've spoken about the sort of variety of spaces, the salon, the auction house, the dealer gallery, the cercle, and all of these spaces, both the established like the salon, but also some of these other more unconventional spaces that the Rousseau is using, they look forward to the future. And that's why, I see him as pioneering, and particularly to Monet. Monet, I think, kind of inherits Rousseau's mantle as a principal avant-garde landscape painter of his period. Rousseau as the Barbizon school leading landscape painter, and Monet as the leading impressionist. And critics made the comparison between them. For example, this painting on the right, which was shown at the 7th Impressionist exhibition, was compared by one critic to Rousseau's a beautiful painting here on the left of a sunset view of Hoarfrost, which is actually on the cover of the catalogue. And then just two bearded men, and who look pretty similar actually. But again, to argue for Monet's approaches, the fact that he's kind of developing the strategies that Rousseau is using or originating or developing, and taking them to a different level, playing off dealers one off against another, organizing one-person shows, really internationalizing his networks of collectors, playing off dealers one against another in a very kind of shrewd way. All of these strategies are things that Monet was using, but I argue, and that they continue until this day, but that have been developed by Rousseau and his peers as early as the 1840s. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So if you have any questions, please type those into the Q&A box, and I will look at those as they come in. While we're waiting for some of those to come in, I did actually have a question. You mentioned that Rousseau was very kind of controlling about, the type of frame that some of his artwork went in, and that kind of thing. Did he write the titles of his artwork?
Yeah, he did. I mean, that's interesting. So, I mean, the titles say a lot about his work. I mean, sometimes they're quite specific, and they do speak to specific places. For example, in the Forest of Fontainebleau, which was a place. I mean, that was a place. I mean, he cared so much about trees. Actually, I mean, there's almost he loved trees. There's no doubt about it. And the kind of anthropomorphic quality of trees. So I think there are particular places in the Forest of Fontainebleau that he agitated for their being saved from deforestation, and had success in that. But sometimes there are also titles which are more generalized. For example, there's an important painting that he showed at the Salon in 1864, which is now at the Frick, which is now called a village of Béquigny. When Rousseau exhibited it, he just called it a village. I think he just wanted to see it as a kind of, a generalized statement, and in that case, not be specifically tied to a place. So I think titles are really important actually in Rousseau's work, and kind of understanding or trying to understand them.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we have a few questions here. Was there any quantifiable long-term or short-term impact on Rousseau's market as a result of his self-managed auction?
I mean, it quantifiable to the extent that, you know, I've visited the Archives de Paris, and actually in the book, you can see the amount that Rousseau raised from the sales. And what I've actually, when I've done this in the past, is actually compared, and this may be for another book. I mean, I'd like to write another book on you know, the Barbizon group, sort of Barbizon radicals, because what Rousseau is doing, I mean, that idea of organizing auctions is something that Diaz, for example, was also doing. Diaz de la Peña, he organized a number of auctions. So you can situate Rousseau's sales within that wider context. Corot also organized a single sale in 1858, Ducamp. So it is quantifiable. And I think, you know, for this talk, I haven't included graphs, but that is something that I'm interested in. I think for the market, you know, that's important to think about, you know, Rousseau's market in quantifiable terms. Unfortunately for Rousseau, there aren't account books which survive. There are for some other artists at the time, like d'Aubigny or Félix Ziem, and actually Monet later on. But Rousseau, you have to rely on his correspondence and, you know, the dealer stock books. But you'll see in the book that I do include the detailed figures from the three sales that the Rousseau organized in 1850, 1861, and 1863. So you can see the quantifiable amounts that he earned from those sales.
Okay, can you discuss his family and background a bit, education and influences?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So his father was a very successful tailor, and you know, I think, you know, it's interesting. His father came from the Jura region, and his father lived to be older than Rousseau. His father died in 1869. His mother actually came from a very interesting artistic family. She came from a family of landscape painters. One most notably called Paul de Saint-Martin was one of Rousseau's early teachers. And I think that background on his mother's side actually encouraged his interest in the landscape painting of France. Paul de Saint-Martin was one of the first artists to paint France and sort of move away from that idea of the historical landscape of painting, you know, mythological and biblical scenes. Yes, I mean, he was I mean, as a family, they were relatively well off, and Rousseau was born right in the center of Paris. And we know that his father was tailor to several important, you know, wealthy figures in Paris. And just to give you one example, when the town of Salins in Jura burned down in 1825, his father, who'd come from that town, donated 10,000 francs to the town, which was quite a significant amount. So he was, so I think, you know, in terms of his background, you could argue that Rousseau's kind of lower middle class. He was an only child. I guess that's another thing to say. And then, yeah, I mean, his relationship with his wife, well, he never formally married her, but his Elisa Gros, who he met in the late 40s. And I think that was part of, it was part of his, and you see that in his correspondence with Son, he was opposed to the idea of marriage as a kind of societal kind of rule that he didn't like, because he, you know, this idea of him being close to nature. So that was something that actually impacted his attitude to marriage. So he and Elisa lived together for 20 years from the late 1840s until his death in 1869. And I think they were close, and she's you know, it'll be great to know more about her. I mean, because shortly after his death, she actually died herself in Charenton-l'École in an asylum, actually. And we know that Rousseau was very supportive of her, and after her death, it's unclear kind of what happened, but his friends weren't as supportive. I think that's fairly clear.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. All right, so here's another question. Success often breeds jealousy. Were fellow artists critical of Rousseau's commercialism while perhaps coveting it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Rousseau was very competitive, and a lot of his fellow artists were also. So I think, I mean, you see that particularly in terms of the other landscape painters. I think Rousseau's principal landscape competitor was Corot. And even as early as the 1840s, so the critic Charles Baudelaire is seeing Corot and Rousseau as the two leading landscape painters in terms of avant-garde landscape. So, I mean, it's difficult to find, I can't think of any particular correspondence where Corot is like sort of coveting Rousseau's success, but I'm absolutely sure that the two competed against each other and they kind of pushed each other. They knew each other, and I mean, there's an interesting example that I talk about in the book. In 1865, they were both commissioned by a Russian aristocrat called Paul Demidov to produce these large decorative panels. That was actually the first time that Rousseau produced decorative painting. Corot had a long history of producing decorative painting. And Rousseau really wanted to beat Corot. And you know, and there's a story that Millet and Rousseau go to Corot's studio and they see Corot's works in process, and Rousseau is very dismissive of them. And he sees them as just, you know, kind of repetitive, the kind of thing that Corot has done before. And that is kind of a trope in Corot's criticism, that he does repeat himself. Whereas Rousseau is arguing that his paintings for Demidov are much more innovative and, you know, experimenting with new kinds of facture and, you know, allowing underdrawing to show through and sort of lack of finish in a way which he saw as more experimental than Corot.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. Did he ever travel outside of France to paint?
He not to paint, but he did go to Switzerland briefly in 1860. And I mean, you can argue that he kind of had vicarious travel. He was interested in, you know, I didn't talk about it in this talk, but he was interested in photography and photographic reproduction. So we know in his correspondence, for example, the son of Diaz went to Italy in the mid 60s, and we know that he asked with Millet that reproductions of Giotto's work should be brought back. He was really interested in Holbein's work in Basel. So there is that kind of vicarious travel that he experienced through reproductive photography, which is now really emerging as an industry in the 1850s and 1860s. But no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's an interesting comparison there with Corot, who did travel quite extensively, you know, painted Italy, painted Switzerland, painted England, painted Holland, but Rousseau did focus very much on France, with the exception of that trip to Switzerland. But I don't know of any paintings that actually he produced during that trip. And you can argue that kind of relates to a kind of a sort of nationalism to his wider artistic project.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. I do want to point out, so the artwork in Slam's collection is currently on view. So if people want to come in, if they're comfortable coming in to see it, it's in Gallery 206, I believe. And then I also, I have put into the chat a link to the place where right now the book can be purchased. I don't believe at this point that the museum shop, it will be carrying the book. So, but you know, that may change in the future. But for right now, that's the best place for you to go to find the book. So thank you so much, Simon. This is wonderful. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. If you'd like, register to join me next Thursday, June 10th at noon, to hear the MFA Boston curator, Denise Doxey, speak about the Royal Women of Napata in connection with the exhibition Nubia, Treasures of Ancient Africa, which is currently on view at the museum. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.